bit about Granted Consultancy. We're based in Exeter. We've been running for over a decade, and we really, thank you, Dan. That's good to know. And so we've raised over 100 million in that time for grants, primarily in grants in technology companies. So we know a lot about what makes a successful application, who to apply to, and help organizations from that very kind of early stage of, I think I've got something that might be suitable for a grant, where do I go, all the way through to kind of, I've been successful, how do we draw it down, how do we make sure we get all of the money that we're eligible for. So we've got a team of 25 based in Exeter, but cover the whole of the UK. So just to kind of kick off, there are two main types of grant, and these are kind of relatively loose terms, but you've probably had experience of them. Capital grants, and those will be where they're aimed at a particular area. So a couple of examples of those might be kind of in the EU under the ERDF program or ESIF programs, which are now coming to a close, and being replaced by the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is something that will kind of people start to hear more about as that develops. And then on the other side of things, you've got innovation grants, and that's for kind of a specific project to develop a specific piece of technology. So today we're going to focus on the innovation grants. The capital grants at the moment are in a bit of a lull because we've exited the EU, and there's a kind of a pause while we're waiting for the further funds to be released. But they will come back, so hence worth mentioning that there. Well, it might be worth just touching on kind of things like intervention rates and those kind of pieces.
Yeah, so typically with funding, the intervention rate, so the amount of funding that you can get is typically a little bit higher. So when we refer to intervention rate, it's usually the percentage of the total project that you can get grant funding. So, if these are massive £100,000 project, typically with innovation funding, you might be able to get up to kind of 70% of that if you're a small company kind of doing fundamental R&D as a grant fund, with the other 30% needing to kind of match fund from your own sources, whether that's shareholder investment, loans, cash in the bank, etc. So 70% is obviously quite a favourable percentage to really kickstart a project. Typically with capital grants, just so you're aware, that intervention rate is a little bit lower. Often it can be kind of around the 35-40% mark. It just does depend on what you're using it for, the size of your company, etc. A variety of legal state aid requirements that we'll try not to bore you with today. But if we focus on the innovation side of things, it's typically kind of 50, 60, hopefully even 70% of your project can be grant funded. Cool. So I suppose just some of the sources of where those funds might come from. So as we said, so we're talking a lot about on the innovation side of things. So a lot of these are national or even international sources, whereas kind of on the capital side, whilst they kind of get filtered down from maybe European level previously, they kind of then get administered at a very much a local level. So those in the Southwest, I may have remembered the days of the Southwest Growth Fund, for example, which was a fund supporting Southwest companies that was very much administered out of Plymouth from memory. So the Innovate UK there in the middle, kind of the largest one, is typically one of the main and primary sources of securing R&D funding. They've got a kind of a £2 billion pot that they look to fund through a variety of kind of research councils, including the likes of Innovate UK. So that is there to support projects across all sectors, trying to do kind of cutting edge research. Right hand side, you've got some of the more European options for R&D. So Eurostars is quite a collaborative project looking to kind of cross European collaboration. Horizon 2020 has now kind of ceased to exist as we've kind of moved into 2021, but it's been replaced with Horizon Europe, which is there at the bottom, which is kind of the new stream of that. And then there's some other ones in there that are slightly more specific. So you've got the National Institute for Health Research, so obviously very much focused on a healthcare perspective, aerospace, GCRF, which is the Global Challenges Research Fund, looking a lot more at supporting, for example, projects that might be helping in kind of developing countries and things like that. So plenty of options out there, plenty of opportunities, kind of regardless of the sector that you're in.
Yeah, and it's worth just highlighting that we're kind of anticipating the innovation strategy from Innovate UK and UKRI, and it looks like some of you may be aware of things like the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, ISCF. There's always lots of wonderful acronyms. that's kind of effectively having a bit of a makeover, and interesting what they were talking about in the prior session about, you know, the Southwest being known for particular sectors. It looks like that's now going to be replaced by kind of 4 missions. So one of those will be net zero, one will be health, which includes kind of human and animal agri-tech. Connectivity is the other one, with kind of transport and digital, and then a skills agenda. So all of those bits kind of will be core to the government strategy for the next, for the foreseeable future. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually comes across. So who can apply for an innovation grant? So generally it's kind of companies of any size. The change following Brexit is that the work typically has to be completed in the UK, which does make it sometimes difficult. For example, if you have a software development house in Eastern Europe or in Asia at all doing your work, it's got to be conducted in the UK. And you're doing an R&D project, and it has impact. And I think that's probably one of the shifts in the last couple of years that we've seen, is a much greater focus on the impact that your project is happening, be that things like net zero, sustainability, be that impact on society, for example, as well. And it has to have that kind of novelty and disruptive, innovative, lots of kind of lovely fashionable terms. It has to be scalable, and you've got to really talk about how you have an understanding of the current market and how it's going to fundamentally change that. So we're not talking about the iterative development element. That would fall under something like the R&D tax credits. This really is those game-changing ideas that are going to be a real kind of step change, which I think is the final one on the term bingo, a real step change in whatever industry you're operating in.
Yeah, and I think that words, it depends on that industry that you're operating in. You know, obviously they're quite, you know, grand terms in being disruptive, game-changing, step change, etc. Is that, you know, if that is a game changer in your industry, it doesn't necessarily need to be something that is, you know, truly going to, you know, cross-sector. It's going to be the next eBay, next Apple, things like that. It's actually more, you know, is it disruptive within your market space, or is it going to create a new market space? If you're kind of ticking that box, then it is definitely novel, it's definitely disruptive, and, you know, might be suitable for funding. So moving on, kind of what the timelines sort of look like for a grant fund or a non-dilutive funding. So I think the first thing to bear in mind is that it's not necessarily the quickest process. There is, you know, as demonstrated on that timeline on the right, there is a process of, particularly if you're going to need partners, whether it's an academic partner or another industrial partner, of kind of going through that stage of making sure you've kind of got a collaborative plan of action in place. Don't underestimate the requirement of actually going to draft an application. It can take 6 to 8 weeks as you kind of go through that iterative process of working out exactly what the work plan is, the costings, making sure you've got your market and your route to market proposition right. Then typically you're looking at kind of 1 month to 3 months of an assessment period. It does vary from competition to competition, and even with, you know, just from round to round, depending on the number of applicants, the number of assessors available, before you actually kind of get a yes or no decision. And then obviously kind of move into a due diligence period where there's some, you know, fairly standard just checks, making sure you're kind of compliant with any regulatory pieces. And then you can kickstart your project. So obviously, as it kind of pointed out on the left, sometimes it's actually easier to kind of build it backwards when you're kind of thinking about your project. So you're thinking about, well, when will my project start, realistically based on the timeframes, and then building it that way. The last thing you want to be doing is kind of proposing a project that you're then having to kind of wait on for a decision, and it's actually kind of slowing the whole process down. So it's making sure that you kind of build that timeline into your thinking, making sure you've built enough space to kind of go through that drafting phase. And one of the kind of tips there on that third point is around trying to keep those partners warm. So if you're looking to collaborate and you're looking to try and use that as expertise, even if you're kind of anticipating there might be a competition coming, or you've got kind of an indication that there might be something on the horizon, it's kind of just starting having those conversations earlier on, just so that you can kind of hit the ground running when that competition is launched. Because sometimes it can be quite a short turnaround. A competition might be launched and there might only be kind of 6 weeks before you have to submit. So if you've got those partners already kind of initially on board with a kind of a plan of action in place, it does really kind of help and speed through that process.
Yeah, and it's worth highlighting that's one of the key benefits of a grant fund. Often it's very difficult to to get a potential end user, a client potentially on board, to be really directly involved in what you're developing. But if you can go to them and say, would you like 200k of grant to be involved in this project, then that will often helps to bring them on board, and also buys them into that process. It helps to validate the idea, brings a lot more rigor to the process as well, so you can stand up kind of and provide that validation, and then for further funding as well for other elements like equity or debt financing, if you're looking at then funding the kind of growth of your company. If you use that grant to bring in all the different players and to help with that collaboration, that can help significantly. So just to kind of cover some of the cost elements that the funds will support. For the innovation funds, the primary cost centre is likely to be staff. Those will be kind of effectively employed staff under PAYE scheme. There's typically an overhead element which you can add on top of those staff costs, and then it's anything that will be utilised during the project. So what that kind of project thinking, that project mentality, is extremely important. They're not necessarily going to fund the whole of your company. They want to fund specifically the outputs that you've said, the objectives of the project, and anybody who needs to be involved in that. So that does give you flexibility. You can say, well, it's going to be 20% of the MD's time, for example, and 100% of the technical director's time. So you do have that flexibility about how you're going to actually resource the project. But you've just got to make sure that everything is eligible. And that's a really kind of key part of the initial phase, defining that work plan so it's effective, and making sure that all the costs are eligible, because you don't want to get through the whole process and then start the claim process and realise that it's not suitable. There's also a piece in there around how you actually make the claims as well, but we can cover that slightly later on.
Cool. So I suppose there's just a couple of examples of what a project might look like. So as we kind of mentioned about the partner situation, is that also you can very much apply on your own. So that top example there is talking about kind of a 12-month project. You've got that 70% intervention rate, so you could be receiving a grant fund there of kind of 350,000 to really kind of push forward that project over the next 12 months, which is, as Tom has mentioned, might cover a large proportion of developer costs as they implement that project. Support from subcontractors, material expenses, etc. The second example there is, they can build out these examples as we start to implement maybe a second academic partner or even another industrial partner. But it's just a relatively simple SME and academic collaboration. You might be able to kind of extend the project out to 20 months. It might be a larger project size of 700k. But importantly is that each project costs are kind of dealt with separately. So as you can see, the SME has their grant on there, and then the university has theirs. Now, the universities typically can receive a higher intervention rate due to their kind of status, which obviously does really help with that collaborative element, and that they don't have that match funding requirement in such the same way. But so you kind of have this collaborative project, costs are dealt with separately, so there's no kind of requirement on the SME side of things, for example, to have to kind of worry about how the university might be paid. So it really is kind of a really beneficial way of collaborating and kind of delivering it. In this case, a £700,000 project could really deliver some sizable outputs that can push forward both, from an academic learning perspective and the SME into a commercial environment.
So a lot of kind of different projects are possible. It's about making sure you architect it effectively initially and think about it properly in terms of what that work plan. It's about planning. Just worth touching upon briefly before we look at kind of the tips for success, that there are funds which are relatively regular. Many of you will have heard of the Innovate Smart Grant, for example, which is typically kind of quarterly, and you can build a project around that kind of sector agnostic type fund. And then if a more specific fund is released in the interim, then you can easily pivot to the more specific fund, which will likely give you a higher chance of success. But how do you be successful? So adopting that project thinking is critical. This is a defined project, and it's one of the kind of key mental shifts that you need, particularly if you're in an earlier stage organization where everything is about growing the company and about company-wide endeavors. This is a very defined project. It can encompass the whole company entirely, but obviously that's a slightly different approach. And don't leave it till the last minute. the number of times that we're contacted by potential clients kind of a week before a submission, and it's just not worth it, bluntly, because you'll be wasting your own time getting a high enough quality application, particularly for those ones which run regularly. They are competitive, so you've got to put in and invest the right amount of time in order to actually be able to be successful.
And then, as Tom's mentioned, to be able to actually have that, not put it in the last minute, you can build in those reviews. And I think we mentioned that on the time frame is, if you can get, even if it's someone who's not been involved in the writing stage, or even independent, if you can, just to review that and just, does this make sense from a narrative perspective? Is it concise, but also kind of got enough technical detail in it? And if you kind of go through that process, hopefully you can kind of really hone that application down. And yeah, I think as we mentioned at the bottom, making sure everything is submitted before the deadline, and that is everything. So appendices, making sure costs of things, and kind of everything is kind of tick that needs to be ticked. So again, it's not leaving it to the last minute. I think Innovate UK, one of the larger funds as we mentioned, I think they have a graph of when applications are submitted in the last 2 hours before deadline. There's a huge spike, and naturally you're going to end up with quite a few that haven't actually made it due to kind of a technical issue on their side, or even just not ticking the right box. So making sure you're submitting before the deadline, and hopefully kind of at least a day before, to kind of not have that last minute stress.
Good. So just in the last couple of minutes before joining Dan for the posture up session, the key piece really is to put in the time. You're talking about upwards of hundreds of thousands of pounds, which you don't have to pay back. You don't have to give any equity in exchange for, which is a wonderful thing and can really catapult an organisation forward. So do make sure you resource that effectively, and take it seriously and go for it, because those companies that do win are those that really put the effort in and make sure they're successful. The initial bit around making sure that you seeing what funds are available to the project that you've got is a complicated element of it, but do kind of follow us on LinkedIn and check out our website. We've got all the current funds listed there. Please do get in contact if you have any queries about any element of it. We've got kind of more webinars coming up fairly frequently about the different elements then of applying and managing the project, and how to bring collaborators together, and what's the best approach for different funders. So do check us out. Feel free to connect or email with any kind of questions or issues that you might have, and just consider grant funding as an integral part to your kind of tech company's development, because it's absolutely available. Great companies win it all the time, and it should be a fundamental part of that funding plan.